Welcome to Vintage Firearms with LT Arms. In this episode, we discuss the life of American sharpshooter and folk heroine, Annie Oakley.
Phoebe Ann Mosey was born August 13, 1860, in a log cabin built by her father in Darke County, Ohio. Her siblings called her Annie, and it stuck. By age 7, she was catching quail and rabbit for the family table with traps she'd made. Eager to learn to shoot the forbidden Kentucky rifle hanging over the mantel, one day she took it down. As she told the story herself, "I was 8 years old when I took my first shot, and I still consider it one of the best shots I ever made. I saw a squirrel run down over the grass in front of the house, through the orchard, and stop on a fence to get a hickory nut." She ran into the house and climbed onto a chair, taking down the rifle. She lugged it outside, rested the barrel on the porch railing, and took aim. Her brother chided her, saying only headshots counted. "It was a wonderful shot, going right through the head from side to side," she said. "My mother was perfectly horrified when I began shooting and tried to keep me in school, but I would run away and go quail shooting in the woods." By the time she was 15, Annie learned that Mr. Katzenberger, the grocer in town, would buy small game from local trappers and hunters, so she stopped by to arrange a deal. Katzenberger agreed to buy all the game she could provide. From that day on, for the rest of her life, she earned her living with a gun. Annie quickly became what was known then as a market hunter, a common occupation of the day. There were no limits, no permits, and no restrictions. A talented hunter could make more money than a miner or a logger and work only part of the year. Unthinkable as that is today, in 1875 the country was packed with game, and a good shot could earn a comfortable living. Indeed, Annie ultimately paid off her mother's mortgage selling her kills. Annie would hunt daily, pack her kills in bunches, and ship them by mail coach to Katzenberger's about 12 miles away. Katzenberger would then resell and ship the game to hotels in Cincinnati, another 80 miles away. Legend has it the hotel chefs preferred her game, as it was always headshot and there were no shot pellets in the meat. Around this same time, Annie was given what she called her first real gun, a Parker Brothers 16-gauge breech-loading hammer shotgun, along with 100 reloadable brass shells. No longer would she have to deal with ramrods and powder horns. One day, the traveling theatrical troupe Butler and Company passed through the area. Frank Butler, namesake of the show, was an exhibition shooter who would perform feats of accuracy and marksmanship for the crowd. It was common practice for him to accept challenges from local shooters. Butler was staying at the hotel owned by the man who bought Katzenberger's game shipments. The hotelier told Butler he had a shooter whom he could go against, and he'd bet $100 Butler would lose. As Butler later said, "It seemed a shame for me to take the money from those country people. I thought there were some country people who thought someone could shoot a little and were ready to lose money, and as I needed it, I went out. I got there late and found the whole town, in fact most of the county, out ready to bet me or any of my friends to a standstill on their unknown. I almost dropped dead when a little slim girl stepped out to the mark with me." Annie was 15 and it was her first big match with someone from outside the area. She won at 23-21 and handed Butler his first defeat. Butler never competed against Annie again. However, he did make her his wife the very next year. They would remain happily married for the rest of their lives. For the next 6 years, the Butlers traveled, working for various circuses and shows, with Annie performing shooting exhibitions and Frank acting as her manager. During this time, she adopted the stage name Annie Oakley. There are many stories about the origin of the name, though none of them have been proven. It seems she just liked the sound of it. In March of 1884, while working for a traveling show called the Arlington and Fields Combination, they pulled into St. Paul, Minnesota. Also in town that week was the most distinguished prisoner of war in America, the Hunkpapa Sioux chief, Sitting Bull, who was blamed for the murder of General George Armstrong Custer at Little Bighorn 8 years earlier. Sitting Bull was then living at the Standing Rock Reservation at Fort Yates and often made trips around the upper Midwest. He would visit local schools and businesses, and in the evenings would take in theater shows. On Wednesday, March 19th, Sitting Bull went to the Olympic Theater to see the Arlington and Fields show. A tiny woman with long brown hair soon appeared, with a rifle, and began snuffing out candles, knocking corks from bottles, and shooting cigarettes from her husband's mouth and coins from his fingers. Sitting Bull was instantly enthralled. Here was a woman who could do rifle tricks like nothing he'd ever imagined. As Annie said, "He was about as taken by my shooting stunts as anyone ever has been. He raved about me and would not be comforted. His messengers kept coming down to my hotel to inquire if I would come see him. I had other things to do and could not spare the time." She was busy, as she always was between shows, with a local shooting match, which if she missed would mean forfeiting her entry fee. Hearing this, Sitting Bull sent $65 to her room in hopes of taking a photograph with her. Annie said, "This amused me, so I sent him back his money and a photograph with my love and a message to say I would call the following morning. I did so, and the old man was so pleased with me, he insisted upon adopting me, and I was then and there christened Watanya Cecilia, or Little Sure Shot. For the remainder of 1884, Annie and Frank worked for another circus and then for several variety shows. Then, in April 1885, William F. Buffalo Bill Cody had an opening in his Wild West show for an exhibition shooter. Frank immediately wired Cody and asked for an audition for Annie. Cody's longtime shotgun exhibition shooter, Captain A.H. Bogardus, billed as champion wing shot of the world, had recently left the show. Most shooting showmen used rifles and revolvers in their acts, shooting only stationary targets. But hitting flying targets with a shotgun was what the crowds really liked to see. Cody doubted a 5-foot, 100-pound woman could hold up under the rigors of daily shotgun performances and withstand all the recoil of repeated shotgun blasts. Annie told him to give her 3 shows, and if he wasn't satisfied with her performance, she would walk, no questions asked. Cody accepted. To prepare, Annie and Frank took the first train to Cincinnati, where she spent most of April on the trap shooting range. To prove her stamina, as well as to gain shotgun practice, Annie attempted the greatest endurance feat of her life. She took 3 16-gauge Parker shotguns and tried to break 5,000 thrown glass balls in a day, a feat performed only twice in history, once by Bogardus himself. She loaded her own guns and stood 15 yards from the traps. After 9 hours, she had broken 4,772 balls. In the second 1,000, she hit 984, which was a record for the time. Annie had only done one endurance attempt previously. A year before, on April 6, 1884, she had broken 934 thrown glass balls out of 1,000, using a Stevens 22 rifle. Her years of shooting moving targets to feed the family were coming to bear. Annie and Frank headed for Louisville, Kentucky, where the Wild West show was preparing to perform for the week. Upon arrival, the show camp was deserted, and Cody was nowhere to be found. He was at the street parade to kick off the show. Annie took the opportunity to get some warm-up. She and Frank hauled her shotguns into the arena, along with a pile of clay pigeons and a trap. They saw a man standing nearby, but paid him no mind as he wasn't dressed like he was part of the Wild West crew. Annie began busting clays, shooting fast, with her gun upside down, right side up, from left and right, with either hand. As she laid down her last gun and prepared to reload, the man sprinted across the field and said, "Fine! Wonderful! Have you got some photographs of you with your gun?" The man was Nate Salisbury, Cody's business partner and manager of the show. He was so impressed, he hired Annie on the spot without even consulting Cody. She was given a solo spot in the program, and for the next 17 years, she would be the second act of the famous Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, billed as Annie Oakley, the peerless wing and rifle shot. Why would such a crowd-pleasing act be placed so early in the 3-hour program? The placement was calculated to put the audience at ease with the continuous crack of firearms. As Wild West show press agent John Burke said, "Women and children see a harmless woman there, and they do not get worried." Annie's act was short, not much over 10 minutes, but in that brief time, she would amaze the world and win the hearts of a generation of admirers. Skipping down the grandstand gangway, bowing, waving, and blowing kisses to the crowd, she would run to the center of the arena, taking her place next to a wooden table covered with rifles and shotguns, which she loaded herself. Frank stood by and began sending clay pigeons from the trap, singles, then doubles, then triples, and on to quads. Annie would quickly break them, never hesitating. One of her most admired feats was to lay a shotgun on the ground about 10 feet away on the far side of the table. She would return to her side of the table, and Frank would launch a bird. She would sprint forward, hurdle the table, pick up the gun, and bust the bird before it hit the ground. She was as much an athlete as she was a shooter. Another crowd pleaser was shooting thrown glass balls with a rifle. She would throw them herself, raise the rifle, and shatter the ball. She would throw 2, blast 1, twirl around completely, and shoot the second one. One of her most spectacular and astonishing feats was breaking a glass ball whirled on the end of a string by Frank, firing backwards over her shoulder while sighting into a mirror. She could also do it using a shiny knife blade for the reflection. She would save her most difficult stunt for the end of her act. As Cheryl Casper describes it in her impeccably researched and thoroughly delightful biography of Oakley, it required 1 rifle, 5 shotguns, 11 glass balls, and just 10 seconds on the clock. She laid the guns on the table all neatly in a row. The rifle she took in her hands and turned upside down. Frank stood ready to throw the glass balls. As the first one went up, Annie broke it with a charge from her inverted rifle. She dropped the rifle, picked up a shotgun, discharged both barrels, and broke 2 more balls in a flash. She put the shotgun down, picked up another, discharged both barrels, and shattered 2 more balls, exchanging guns 5 times until she had broken 11 glass balls. And with that, Annie laid her last smoking shotgun on the table, kissed her hand to the audience, and took off running across the arena, never stopping for breath until the last moment she disappeared behind the white canvas curtains. And always, just before she ducked out of sight, she gave a humorous little kick. That little kick became as much a part of her act as the glass balls she smashed. Though she performed mainly with rifle and shotgun, she was just as good with handguns and could split playing cards edgewise with the mirror while Frank held the card. She was completely ambidextrous and could perform equally well with both hands. Her abilities were truly superhuman, speed and agility so astonishing that she was accused of cheating many times. As she said, "It is also very easy and simple, and looks it, that the hardest thing in the world is to make people believe that there is no cheating." She would even miss on purpose and worked it into her act with a pouting, hair-flipping, foot-stomping display. In one town, the crowd was so convinced there was trickery afoot that they appointed a committee to investigate. Naturally, nothing was found amiss, and people wondered why she wasn't insulted. She said, "It is only natural that people should try to find fault. Perhaps, had I been among the audience, I might have done so myself." One spectator in France was so sure the act was fake, he tossed his pocket watch up for her to shoot. She said, "He's never been able to tell the time by that watch since. Doubtful whether he ever picked up 100th part of the pieces." Over the years, Annie used many guns in her act, but her mainstays were a Marlin 1891 .22 rifle, a Winchester 1873 and .44-40. Like the rifle Cody used, this was a smoothbore. Firing bullets in the show would have been wildly dangerous for the spectators in the surrounding area. Instead, cartridge cases were loaded with powder and number 11 shot pellets. Hitting a flying target with such a small shot load is likely tougher than hitting it with a solid bullet. She was also fond of the Winchester 1892. Parker shotguns were her go-to, and she also used Francot's, Ithacas, and L.C. Smith's. In 1887, the Wild West show spent the year in England, performing for record crowds and even Queen Victoria herself, who had become quite reclusive by that point. During that trip, Annie was invited to a live pigeon shoot on a private hunting field owned by Charles Lancaster, the famed gunmaker. The targets were blue rock pigeons, smaller and much swifter than American pigeons. Annie shot poorly, just 5 out of 20. She was embarrassed as some of the best shooters in Britain were watching. Being Annie, she resolved to get better on these lightning-fast blue rocks. Lancaster had been watching her shoot, and he observed that her shotgun did not fit her well. He asked her for the gun, an American-made Parker, bedecked in gold and featuring an engraving of Annie. He found it pretty, but felt that its 7.5-pound weight was too much, and that the stock had too much drop, causing her to shoot under the birds. Lancaster set about making Annie a new gun. A 12-bore side-by-side, shortened stock, 28-inch barrels, light trigger, weighing just 6 pounds. The gun fit her perfectly, and her shooting improved, which is really saying something about arguably the greatest exhibition shooter to have ever lived. Annie immediately ordered 2 more shotguns from Lancaster, both 20 bores, which weighed just 5 pounds 2 ounces each. He eventually made at least 4 guns for her that summer. For the remainder of her life, all her guns would be made to the measurements created for her by Lancaster. Most importantly, on September 30th, just a couple months after her first try, Annie downed 41 of 50 Blue Rock pigeons with her 20-bore Lancaster guns. As she later wrote in a letter to Charles Lancaster, "Dear Sir, the 4 breech-loading hammerless guns you built for me are, in my opinion, as near perfection as it is possible to get them. The pair of 20 bores I have been using now nearly 2 years. I find them just as tight and sound as when new. I've never had any repairs except having the locks cleaned. The pair of 12 bores are as good as the 20s. Since using your guns and receiving a few lessons from you at your splendid private shooting grounds, my shooting in the field has so much improved that now I always make a good score, even at fast and difficult birds. With many thanks for the pains you have taken in making me such perfect fitting and fine shooting guns, I am, gratefully yours, Annie Oakley." She also owned and used Stephen tip-up rifles and Stevens single-shot pistols, as well as the expected Colts and Smith & Wessons. Annie owned hundreds of guns over her lifetime, so many that we cannot document them all. She was arguably the most famous woman in the world in the late 19th century, and all the major gun makers of the day would send her guns, unrequested and usually highly embellished and personalized, in hopes she would use them in her show and get them noticed. Annie was injured in a train accident in 1901. By 1902, her hair having turned completely white, Annie retired from the Wild West show permanently. She pursued a short film career. She competed in trap shooting competitions, and Frank went to work as a representative for United Metallic Cartridge. In 1909, during a trap competition at Pinehurst, North Carolina, she and Frank fell in love with the Carolina Hotel and Club, and in 1915 decided to spend the season there, the first of many seasons. At Pinehurst, Annie would do shooting demonstrations on their trap field. As an extension of this, she soon began teaching women to shoot, and within a few months of 2-hour daily courses, had taught over 700 women the art of target shooting and safe firearms handling. Annie and Frank also enjoyed many days afield hunting quail and other birds in the nearby hunting grounds. One day, in February 1917, Annie gave an impromptu shooting exhibition that drew over 700 spectators and a local reporter, who gave a glowing review of her abilities, easily hitting tossed coins, marbles, the cigarette in Frank's mouth, and even an apple off of her dog's head. In November 1922, Annie was involved in a terrible car accident that broke her right hip and ankle when she was pinned under the flipped vehicle. She would wear a brace on the leg for the rest of her life. Though she continued shooting and making appearances, her health decline began at this point. Annie Oakley died November 3, 1926, aged 66. Frank was devastated by her passing and died just 18 days later, aged 79. They are buried next to each other in a cemetery near Greenville, Ohio. Annie Oakley remains as one of the most iconic of Americans, a woman who made her way in a man's world, all the while remaining most ladylike. Her shooting exploits are legendary, and her memory has been continually celebrated in films, stage plays, TV shows, and museums, an American markswoman and ambassador for the ages.